Long before the sound of engines and steel rails echoed through New York, the city was a tapestry of wooden carts, cobbled streets, and human voices. It was a place of tides of ships that rose and fell with the harbor waters, tides of people who arrived by the thousands from far-off shores, tides of fortune that could lift a man to comfort or pull him down into hunger. In the very center of Lower Manhattan lay a neighborhood that, to outsiders, seemed almost mythical in its notoriety, a place of danger and color, of misery and survival. They called it 5 Points. It had not always been this way. In the early days of the Republic, the land here had been the bed of Collect Pond, a clear body of spring-fed water where families once came to fish in summer and skate in winter. The water was sweet and clean, a gift to the growing city. But industry crept to its edges, tanneries, slaughterhouses, breweries, and dumped their waste directly into the pond. The water grew foul, its surface film green and stagnant. By the early 1800s, it was no longer a place of leisure, but of stench. The city decided to drain it. Workers filled it in with earth, rock, and rubbish. Streets were laid, buildings rose, and for a moment, it seemed progress had triumphed. But the land beneath was never dry. Moisture seeped upward, foundations sagged, walls cracked, and basements became wet cellars where mold thrived. The respectable families who had first moved in began to leave, heading to cleaner, higher ground uptown. Their fine brick houses were divided, subdivided, and divided again, until rooms meant for one family held 3, then 4, then more. And so, by the middle of the 19th century, 5 Points had become the most crowded neighborhood in the United States, and perhaps the most crowded in the world. The first light of day slid slowly over crooked rooftops, filtering through gaps between buildings that leaned toward one another like tired old men. In rooms barely larger than a closet, people stirred on straw pallets, wooden bunks, or the bare floor. Inside the tenements, air was heavy with a mingled perfume, damp plaster, last night's cooking fires, and the unwashed scent of too many bodies in too small a space. Wooden staircases groaned under the weight of early risers heading to the pump, to the docks, or to whatever work could be found that day. In one such building, a widow from County Cork ladled weak tea into a cracked mug, shaking her sleeping son awake for his run as a newsboy. In another, a German tailor's apprentice polished the one pair of boots he owned, readying himself for a walk to the workshop on Pearl Street. Above them, in the attic, 2 seamstresses slept in shifts, one returning from the all-night mending hall, the other preparing to take her place. Out on the street, the neighborhood's voices began their chorus. Bread sellers calling fresh loaves, penny apiece, coal hawkers offering lumps by the basket, and mothers calling their children home from the gutters. 5 Points in the morning was not quiet, but it was gentler than at night. The dangers that prowled in darkness retreated with the rising sun. The gang still lingered in doorways, but the business of the day, survival, took precedence. To understand 5 Points, one had only to stand at the center of its star-shaped crossroads. Here, 5 streets met: Anthony, Cross, Orange, Mulberry, and Little Water. Buildings hemmed them in so tightly that the sky overhead was reduced to a crooked pentagon of pale blue or smoky gray, depending on the weather. A single block could hold 7,000 people, more than lived in some entire rural towns. Each building, once proud brickwork, now bore the marks of long neglect: cracked lintels, sagging shutters, plaster that flaked away to reveal damp brick beneath. In the cellars, families lived almost underground, with only a slit of a window near the ceiling to admit air. Rats moved freely, bold as house pets. Upper floors were little better. The climb to the 5th or 6th story was a climb through darkness, the stairwells lit only by whatever sunlight could sneak past neighboring roofs. A visitor might think such conditions unlivable, and yet they were lived in. People cooked in doorways, mended clothes on stoops, and leaned out of windows to speak to neighbors across the narrow gap. The street itself served as kitchen, parlor, and in some cases, bedroom. 5 Points survived on its own kind of economy. 1 part labor, 1 part resourcefulness, and 1 part sheer luck. The Irish, who had arrived in great waves after the potato blight of the 1840s, filled the ranks of dock workers and construction crews. They dug sewers, hauled bricks, and loaded ships. The Germans brewed beer in small damp cellars and baked bread for their neighbors. African American residents, many of them descendants of those freed in New York's gradual abolition, found work as waiters, barbers, and musicians. Italians sold fruit from pushcarts, their bright pyramids of oranges and lemons, a splash of color amid the brick and soot. Women carried equal weight in this economy. They took in laundry, stood at sewing tables in dim workshops, sold bread, or peddled small goods in the street. Some worked from home, piecing together garments or making buttonholes by candlelight long into the night. Children worked too. They were messengers, shoeshine boys, paper sellers, rag pickers. They clambered through ash heaps to find scraps of cloth or metal to sell. The youngest carried water for neighbors in exchange for a crust of bread. Childhood here was not an age of innocence, but a brief apprenticeship in survival. Among the many trades of 5 Points, rag picking was one of the most common. Rag shops bought old cloth by weight, paying pennies for burlap sacks full of discarded shirts, table linens, and torn dresses. These would be sorted, some to be resold as patch material, others to be pulped into paper. Rag pickers moved with practiced eyes, scanning gutters, trash heaps, and alleys for anything salvageable. They knew which streets offered the best finds on certain days, near the markets after closing, or behind the houses of the slightly better off on laundry day. It was filthy work. Hands came away black with grime, and the rags themselves carried whatever illnesses had touched their former owners. But in a place where steady wages were rare, a day's haul could mean food and lodging for the night. In the 1850s, the threat of disease was constant. Tuberculosis, typhus, and cholera haunted the streets. Cholera was the most dreaded. Its onset was sudden: stomach cramps, vomiting, and an unquenchable thirst. The victim could be gone in a day. When cholera struck, the neighborhood changed. Doors closed, curtains stayed drawn, and people avoided the public pumps, though there was nowhere else to get water. City health officials sometimes ordered buildings emptied and fumigated. Families carried their belongings into the street with nowhere to go, forced to sleep under the open sky or seek space in overcrowded church basements. Death carts rolled slowly down the narrow streets, collecting bodies for burial in the potter's field. Yet 5 Points was famous not only for its poverty, but for its gangs. Groups like the Dead Rabbits, the Bowery Boys, and the 5 Pointers staked out territories. Their members were young men, some barely into their teens, hardened by the streets. They carried clubs, knives, or whatever weapons they could manage. The gangs were both predators and protectors. They guarded their neighborhoods against rivals, but also demanded protection money from local businesses. Fights were common, sometimes small skirmishes, sometimes full street battles that drew crowds to watch. Despite the violence, gang members were woven into the community. They drank at the same saloons, danced at the same halls, and attended the same wakes as their neighbors. In 5 Points, the lines between criminal, neighbor, and protector were often blurred. Sunday was different. Many factories closed, and the streets filled with music. Paradise Square, a wider, open space at the heart of the neighborhood, became a stage. Irish step dancers tapped intricate rhythms, while African American performers answered with percussive footwork of their own. From this blend, a new form of dance, tap, was being born. Children played with hoops made from barrel rings or balls of rags. Women gathered on stoops to sew and talk. Men pitched pennies against walls or gambled at makeshift tables. Street vendors sold beer from kegs, gingerbread from trays, and roasted chestnuts from iron pans. For a few hours, the hardships of the week eased. Music and laughter rose into the air, and the scent of roasting meat mingled with the usual smells of the street. Every so often, a journalist or reformer came to 5 Points, notebook in hand, eager to capture the life of the slum. Some wrote with sympathy, others with sensationalism. Their words traveled far beyond the city, shaping 5 Points' reputation as both a place of danger and a place of resilience. Residents had mixed feelings about such attention. They resented being treated as curiosities, but they also wanted their struggles known. Between the grim reports were moments of pride, stories of a neighbor's kindness, of a street's collective effort to help a family in need, of music that drew people together across lines of language and origin. As the sun set, the neighborhood shifted. Gas lamps cast small islands of yellow in the darkness. Saloons lit their windows, music drifted out, and the narrow alleys filled with shadows. Those who could hurried home before the gangs grew bolder and the night trains began. Some worked through the night, bakers, dockhands, seamstresses with urgent orders. Others sought what pleasures they could afford, a drink, a dance, a game of cards. In back rooms and upstairs halls, deals were struck, songs were sung, and the city's poorest kept its own hours long after midnight.